Okay. And there are some people, more people coming in. So let's get set up on YouTube and then we'll get started. Taking a little longer tonight to get set up. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, so we're live on YouTube and of course live over here. And I was talking about a report that I actually got from I've gotten several reports done from different companies just out of curiosity to see what kind of differences there are from one company to another company. And there is a big difference between these companies. The genes are the same, but some are more accurate than others. And over the years, over the last, I'd say 2 years, I've taken a deep interest in learning about what the lifestyle and nutritional inputs are that affect these genes. Now, it used to be that when the Human Genome Project was done, I think that was in the 80s or in the 90s, or probably in the 90s, and they basically sequenced the entire human genome, and they thought at that time that that was just going to be this huge advance because that we'd be able to see the genetic basis of everything. And it turned out that we found that lifestyle, environment, or what's called epigenetics, the input of various other inputs like the environment and nutrition have upon genes, which basically means that while the genes are important, they are not an indicator of your destiny in any sort of way. And that's an amazing thing, because if you have certain predispositions to things, through environment, nutrition, for the most part, you can modify these risk factors. And you'll see that as we go through tonight's episode. We'll be going through some of these genes, and you'll understand how actually these things can be modified. And that's sort of an interesting thing for me, because I've been doing these reports on patients of mine. And, they've actually done studies to show that when people see they have a genetic susceptibility to, say, saturated fat causing weight gain, one of the genes we'll be talking about tonight, that by just knowing that they have this gene, it actually makes them more likely to make positive impacts. So that's sort of the situation. Sheila's saying that sequencing began in 1999 and was completed in June 2000. Okay, so in the late 90s. Okay, so let me share my screen and then we'll get started. All right, so you should see my screen. And as always, let me blow my screen up here. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat box. And let me bring up the chat box so it's visible. And then we'll get started. And because we have 10 genes, this is going to be a very superficial overview that if you're interested in then pursuing or running one of these tests, you can get these done and learn about a whole host of other things and even go deeper into these genes. So let's start with gene number 1. And let me blow my screen up here. It doesn't seem to be, there we go. Okay, so the first gene is called the CoMT gene. And don't really get bogged down by all the letters that we'll be talking about tonight. The real goal of episode 40 tonight is really for you to just see what's available, get an overview of what's called nutrigenomics or genomics, which is a study of genes, nutrigenomics being the study of how nutrition interacts with genes, and just to get an overview of this topic, because you're going to see more of it, and it's going to play a more important role, I believe, in what's called precision medicine, which is basically, personalized medicine, where you can get these tests and it can sort of narrow in what kind of diet perhaps would be ideal for you. So a CoMT gene basically codes for the metabolism of dopamine, estrogen, and adrenaline. Now we're going to be focusing mostly on dopamine. And we spoke about dopamine last week, actually. Let me close some of these down here. And dopamine is really critical to what's called the prefrontal cortex. Now, last week, remember, I spoke about how when you're in excess stress, when your body is basically shifting from what's called the human brain, which is, the prefrontal or the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe, that's the higher function. That's what distinguishes us as humans. And then we have what's called the animal brain, which is really going to be focused on, lower value sorts of things or survival things. Then we have what's called the reptile brain and the brainstem, which is really focused on just basic human functioning. And when we are in a lot of stress, it's almost like you chemically decapitate your higher self, your higher brain function, which basically means that you're no longer operating from your prefrontal cortex. Everything shifts into protection mode. And a lot of this is involved with dopamine. Now, people have different genetic subtypes, different what are called SNPs. SNPs stand for single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are variations in the gene. So some people have variations in the gene, and they can have usually one of three variations. One is like in the middle, and one is on either end. That's probably the easiest way to describe it. So if the prefrontal cortex is basically going to have problems functioning from either too high or too low dopamine. And it turns out that some people can get rid of dopamine at a different rate than others. So people who are warriors are what are called fast metabolizers. And that means that the dopamine is in their brain and it rapidly gets digested in a way, it gets metabolized, it goes away. And when it goes away, these lower levels of dopamine are actually helpful in threatening situations. And so these people often have lower levels of dopamine. And as a result, they thrive on deadlines. They often benefit from sometimes boosting their dopamine a little bit by coffee or chocolate or green tea, citrus, bananas. All these can help with a dopamine boost. And they also thrive on the edge. They like things like, jumping out of planes or surfing or mountain biking, these sorts of things. Now, just because you like to jump out of a plane or you love surfing or you're a thrill seeker doesn't absolutely mean that you have this gene. But I can tell you from doing a fair number of analyses of these that a lot of sort of inclination and behavioral preferences really does match this. And of course, it's 38% of the population, and 16% are what are called slow metabolizers, which we're going to talk about next. And then the rest are intermediates. And that basically means that they're in the middle, but they often tend to have a little bit of average to a slightly higher dopamine level. So warriors, and neither of these is good or bad. Just, the geneticists labeled these people warriors and warriors. There's nothing negative about being a warrior. You just have a slower metabolizer function of getting rid of your dopamine, which basically means that you're going to have, because you can't break it down as quickly, you're going to have a higher level of dopamine in your brain. And when you have a higher level of dopamine, that's very useful in complex performance of memory and attention. Now, which can be a very, very good thing. In fact, in less stressful environments, these people who are warriors, who have this slow metabolizer gene, actually have a cognitive advantage. And when you have this warrior gene, you just know that you need to spend time learning how to deal with the stress. Maybe it means slowly incorporating, stressful things slowly so that you can become aware of them, that you can adapt to those situations. This can be very, very helpful for people to sometimes, they just feel like they can't handle the stress. And when they know that they are slow metabolizer, it makes them realize that they're actually, one, have advantages that they're not necessarily acknowledging. Because sometimes, you tend to think of something as a weakness, but when you learn about genes, what's really amazing is that all of these things that sound like negatives, at some point in evolutionary history, there was a reason why this happened. And it usually has to do with a strength of some sort. Now, we've all moved around the world and we're exposed to different things, but just because you have a genetic, what sounds like a genetic deficiency or a negative SNP of some sort, doesn't mean that it doesn't mean it's your destiny. And in fact, it means learning these things that you can do something to modify them. So if you're a worrier, then you have to acknowledge your stress and learn how to deal with it a little bit better. Vitamin C and magnesium are very, very helpful for these people because it can prevent the dopamine from getting too high, and that's going to cause the situation that we spoke about. Whereas people who are low, they engage in things that are going to raise their dopamine because that's helpful for them. And those people, as I said, thrive on deadlines. They're the people that do everything at the last minute. I mean, this is part of what makes them makes them efficient by sort of doing these sorts of things. So that's a very interesting one. People who are average to slightly higher dopamine levels, these people who are intermediates, because they have slightly higher dopamine levels, then basically vitamin C and magnesium can also be helpful for them as well. You have to look at the whole picture as you're doing these. And that's why sometimes it's nice to talk to someone who's gone through a lot of these reports. And I do that for my patients. And I find it to be really rewarding. Okay, so that's CoMT gene. And it's one of the most interesting ones only because it has like this behavioral, almost like this feeling of, you can actually categorize someone's part of their personality based on this processing of dopamine in the brain. Okay, next gene is called MTHFR. And many people have heard of this gene because it's been in the news, or at least in sort of alternative health websites and things like that. It also has a funny look to it. I'm sure you can understand why people call it something else when they see MTHFR. And this is the one that there are many, many MTHFR genes. The one we're going to focus in on is this one. Again, you don't have to remember these. This lecture, this one is called C677T. But again, we're not focusing on any of these letters only because this is a very cursory overview of what's available in genetic testing and how you get around it. So this can be associated with elevated homocysteine levels. Now, elevated homocysteine levels can be associated with an increase in blood clots and heart disease. And for people who have elevated homocysteine levels, there's lots of ways of lowering those, especially by using a combination of B vitamins. And what's happening basically here is folate, which we've spoken about before, that's in lots of leafy green vegetables, isn't converting properly to 5-MTHFR, which is sort of the end product. And as a result, basically people are getting elevated homocysteine levels. So what we spoke about why homocysteine levels are important because of blood clots, heart disease, but some strokes, a couple other things. And people who have heterozygous or homozygous, in other words, remember I spoke about how there's sort of three options. There's a middle, which is what's called heterozygous, and then there's homozygous. And homozygous is on both sides. But anyway, just keep in mind that there are basically three options. So if there are two variations here, and those people need increased B12, dietary methylfolate for a normal homocysteine, fertility, pregnancy, and BH4. BH4 being a brain, something that's in the brain that can affect neurotransmitters. So why is this important? it's important because if you have one of these markers and you're not getting the type of proper folate and B vitamins, then you can have issues with your brain, your emotions, your mood. And also you need to make sure you're getting, it's also something that is basically going to tell you that you basically need to be on a plant-rich diet, because you don't want to have to supplement. You want to always try to modify things based on, diet. So it's best if you can get a plant-rich diet, because those people need all that extra folate to make sure that they're getting the amount of folate that they need, because the enzyme's not functioning properly. So you need a lot of folate. The issue is some people, as we spoke about before, the end product is this 5-MTHFR. Some people take 5-MTHFR as a supplement, but unfortunately, this can lead to, if you take too much of it, you can get high nitric oxide levels, and people get panic attacks from that. Sometimes they use niacin to sort of try to find the proper dose, because niacin can bring that down. The point being that if you're eating a plant-rich diet, then you're probably going to be okay. You probably would be best taking a good B vitamin, or just a B complex, or a multivitamin that has B vitamins in it. And as I was mentioning before, these things evolve based upon the environment. And so this is found more commonly in places where plants are to be found, more commonly in the diet. So in other words, what was happening there? The gene wasn't really needed, and it wasn't that important, basically, because people were already getting those particular plants, that amount of folate. So it wasn't something that was important and selected for. So all of these things have sort of a genetic evolutionary basis to them. And if you were to test, a lot of people have this. I actually have this marker, but I've always eaten a lot of vegetables. I feel much better with eating a lot of vegetables, and I've never had high elevated homocysteine levels, probably because I've just always, maybe it was a natural adaptation that I just feel better with eating leafy greens. And as a result, I haven't had any issue with homocysteine levels. But if people have this, it's one of those things that definitely is important to check to see if you have elevated homocysteine. All right, let's move on to number 3. So number 3 is called the APOE gene, and this one is associated with Alzheimer's disease, and specifically this APOE4. Now, APOE3, no increase in Alzheimer's. APOE2 has actually a decreased risk of Alzheimer's, but the risk for Alzheimer's disease is significant. It's significant enough that if you have the APOE4 gene, and a lot of people, especially, I can tell you in the community of physicians that I know that are very proactive about their family's health and their patients' health, they all know their APOE4 status, because the studies are pretty significant for APOE4 being related to an increased risk of disease. Now, as I said from the very beginning of tonight's episode, that while you might have a gene, it's not your destiny. You're not predetermined to get Alzheimer's disease if you have APOE4. If you do, there's lots of things that you can do. Your risk is dramatically reduced by diet, having very deep sleep, mental exercise, and physical exercise. A Mediterranean diet is recommended, but alcohol in this group increased the risk at very low levels, in fact. So while people recommend a Mediterranean diet with a glass of wine, for people who have the APOE4 gene, you're not going to really want to have alcohol, because that increased the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Additionally, there have been several studies to show that saturated fat in this particular diet, in this particular genetic marker, is associated also with an increased risk. So, we hear lots of people talking about how saturated fat doesn't mean anything anymore, and widespread studies show it's not associated with heart disease and such. Well, if you have the wrong genes, it can be bad. And it's not just this gene, but there's another gene that we're going to be talking about a little bit later that shows that if you eat a certain amount of saturated fat, it's associated with weight gain much, much more than people who don't have that gene. So we'll get to that later on. So the important thing here to recognize is that one, it could be a potential, it's scary if you have the APOE4 gene, but that does not mean you're going to get Alzheimer's. But what it does mean is that you really need to get your lifestyle in order so that you can reduce your risk dramatically. And you can reduce your risk dramatically, absolutely dramatically reduce the risk by incorporating healthy lifestyle. And specific, have a healthy lifestyle. As we said, we don't want to drink alcohol, we want to have a healthy Mediterranean diet. And there are many people who have written guidelines for this type of marker to make sure that you can reduce the risk dramatically. Okay, let's move on to number 4. So this is a TCF7L2. Again, don't worry about the letters. And this is a very strong indicator of type 2 diabetes. And what makes it so interesting is that people who have this genetic marker are not overweight. They don't look like they would have type 2 diabetes. They often have low triglycerides, and but they still have type 2 diabetes. So I call it the skinny person's type 2, people, the skinny diabetes gene. In other words, people who are not overweight, who have type 2 diabetes. And the people who have this, the increased risk here is hypothesized to be due to an effect of this gene on sensitivity of the pancreatic beta cells to incretins, which not overall insulin sensitivity. This is associated. There's actually medicines out there now that you see on TV that work by this mechanism, like Trulicity is one of the medicines that you see commercials on. That's what that medicine works on. And these people who have this, the ideal diet is actually low in sugar and grain. So anything that these two things can spike your blood sugar. But in this particular case, if you have this gene, you should be on a low sugar, low grain diet, which basically means lots of leafy greens and lean proteins and staying away from grains and sugar. And if you have this, you really want to protect your beta cells. So spices like turmeric and cinnamon are important. Cordyceps mushroom might be very, very good because it's been shown to help. And so there are as I said, every time we come across one of these things that has an increased risk, then this is one of the times where you can say, okay, well, that's great. So we know what to do about it. You can reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes, get rid of it probably, by this and by incorporating spices, but ideally to making sure that you're really not taxing your beta cells. And you do that by avoiding these spikes in sugar from sugar and from refined grains. All right, so let's move on to number 5. So this is GSTM1, and this is related to glutathione. Now, we've spoken about glutathione in various other episodes where we spoke about glutathione being sort of like the master antioxidant in the body and detoxifier. And when people have a certain SNP here, they have a higher risk of cancer from environmental toxins. That means that they need to optimize their bodies to optimize liver detoxification, basically. So if you have the gene, it's most effective at neutralizing cytotoxic, so those chemicals that damage the cell, and genotoxic, those compounds, chemicals that can damage the DNA. And people with the null genotype, that's what it's called, should avoid benzoapyrene, which is basically an aromatic, polycyclic aromatic from charred foods, things like grilled meats, as an example, would have a high level of that, or browned foods that are brown, even grilled fish, any kind of grilled brown, black type of thing is going to have that. So people who have this gene really need to avoid that. And so they focus, and I've spoken about this before, that when people, just in general, you want to avoid these, but if you have this gene, you absolutely want to avoid it. And if you have that gene, then you really need to focus on different cooking techniques like steaming, braising, making water-based stews, that sort of thing that's going to reduce the amount of browning that you're getting from foods. Diets and supplements can help. Vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, curcumin, green tea. A study in Norway showed vitamin C helped because it can affect, it was specific in pregnant women who had this gene. Vitamin C helped with making sure they had, can't remember exactly what the study was, but something to do with the health of the baby, essentially. And also, people with this particular genotype really need to make sure they're getting cruciferous vegetables. So that's broccoli, kale, collards, cabbage, mustard greens, that sort of thing. And they also might be more sensitive to mercury. So again, as always, if you have this without doing anything, it's true that you are maybe at a higher risk of cancer from things in your environment than maybe someone else might be. But if you focus on getting rid of the browned meats and the grilled meats and the grilled fish and such, and focus on really eating lots of leafy greens, lots of cruciferous vegetables, probably taking vitamin C, that you're going to just optimize that part of your system that is basically going to be neutralizing a lot of these compounds that you really couldn't do naturally because of the genetic marker that you have. And, these genes are very, very common. And, when I go through these 10 with patients, most people have several of these. I have several of these. Everyone has several of these. I have this gene here. I have, members of my family that are not overweight that have type 2 diabetes. But my blood sugar and is perfectly good because I avoid sugar and grains for the most part, and pretty much try to get spices in as much as possible. So I'm not concerned at all about type 2 diabetes, even though I have this gene. So everyone's going to have several of these genes. It's not something to concern yourself or worry about, but it does give you the knowledge to be able to make educated decisions that are personalized and precision for yourself. All right, so let's move on to number 6, which is NAT2, which is very sort of similar in a way. It's what's called if you have a slow acetylator marker, that is basically a type of detoxification, basically. And it's also a problem with aromatic amines from the environment, chemicals in industrial tobacco, diesel exhaust. And how do you modify that? Well, marinades of meats, because when if you're going to have cooked meat, if you marinate the meat in antioxidants, in fact, they once did a study marinating meat in dark beer, and even that reduced the amount of chemicals that people get, these negative chemicals that they get from over grilling that we sort of spoke about here in the GSTM1. Cruciferous vegetables again, and polyphenols. So all the pigments are going to be helpful in improving this slow acetylator function that you have. This, you're not capable of doing something if someone, compared to someone who has the proper genes. So blackberries, blueberries, grapes, kiwi, watermelon, rosemary, and parsley are also very good. So these two are very on a superficial level, they're very, very similar. Okay, let's keep on moving and go to number 7. It's GPX1. Again, don't worry about the letters. And this is related to oxidative stress. And we've spoken about oxidative stress, which can be from physical stress, but can also be from chemicals and such. And really what's actually happening is that your body actually produces H2O2 peroxide, and you need to be able to, it's the way partly the way your body defends itself. And that H2O2 then has to be converted to water. If it doesn't, it can damage the mitochondria, and this is associated with mitochondrial health. And I believe I did an entire episode on mitochondrial health. So go back to that if you're interested in learning more about that. It's also associated with various cancers, but with conflicting reports, basically. And it's probably related to the fact that the enzyme does need selenium. So people who have the gene that's the genetic marker that's associated with an issue with this might need a higher need for selenium and fruits and vegetables. So as you're seeing here a trend that fruits, vegetables, leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, polyphenols, pigmented things in plants are overall going to help with lots of things in the body. And there has been a fair amount of talk about people who are increasing their meat consumption to very, very high levels. In fact, people who are on what are called carnivore diets. And all I can say is that when you learn about things from a genetic basis, you'll see that there are certain people, there's that no question that they need to have lots of fruits and vegetables. And quite frankly, I think everyone really does. The question is how to choose the right ones that your body tolerates and are geared to your unique situation. And in that case, that's why these genetic markers can be helpful, because as I said, if you have GSTM1, then you're going to want to have a lot of cruciferous vegetables in your diet. And it may be that you want to focus on those, not exclusively, but you want to focus on getting, probably 50% of the vegetables that you eat as cruciferous vegetables. As a general rule, you want to get vegetables from various different families. And we've spoken about that many times. But if you happen to have this particular gene, then you probably want to focus on the cruciferous vegetables because of the effects that they have. I might add that I didn't include a gene here, but there's another gene that shows that some people who have excess salt, have high blood pressure. Of course, we've heard that for years, that if you eat too much salt, that you're going to have high blood pressure. But there are genetic markers that are not associated with that. And so that sort of recommendation is another one of those things that's potentially going to yield different results in the media, where one day there's a study that says that coffee is good for you, and then the next day there's a study that says coffee is bad for you. Well, in that example with caffeine, there are people that do have trouble metabolizing caffeine, and those people do have a higher rate of non-fatal heart issues, and with not a huge amount of caffeine. So again, all of these sorts of things, whenever you see these studies out in the news where one thing conflicts another, and everyone is so confused, a lot of the reasons why that is because they haven't studied the genetic markers of the people that are causing it to flip from one side to the other. And so a lot of what we're going to see over the coming years as this science continues to refine itself is that we're going to be able to determine that, at least tease out all those confusing things, because they're going to be associated with different types of genetic markers. And that is what is really exciting. So whenever you really hear one thing that, like eggs are good for you one day, the next day they're as bad as smoking, salt, that sort of thing, just be patient or look into it yourself. Look into the genetic markers associated with these things, and you might be able to find something that is going to resolve that paradox. Okay, let's move on to number 8, PEMT. Again, don't worry about the letters. Again, this is just a cursory overview. And this encodes for an enzyme in the liver that methylates. Now, the MTHFR that we spoke about, the first one's also methylation. Methylation is basically where your body sort of attaches, it's called a methyl group, onto a molecule. And so there are lots of genes that actually do that. MTHFR is one of them as well. And well, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, or I'll have like a flashback to organic chemistry in college, where you learned about all that sort of thing. And I really, really disliked organic chemistry, as most people do. Oh, I really disliked that class. So, okay, so basically this methylation that you have a deficiency in, it means that you need increased need for choline. Now, choline might sound familiar. We spoke about it last week, actually. Choline is needed to create something called acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. It's going to be very important for your brain as well. But for people, especially women who have this gene, it's also going to be associated with homocysteine that we spoke about, breast health and healthy pregnancy. And it's interesting, you know, that choline is high in eggs, egg yolks especially. And there are tribes, several tribes that I read about where they lived inland, but whenever a woman was pregnant, they would travel hundreds of miles to the sea to get fish eggs for the pregnant women. Now that may not be choline. It might just be fish oil or DHA, which can help with the brain function. But nonetheless, choline is very important for, especially if you have this gene and you're a woman. It's also modified by estrogen as well. So that's why this one is very important for women. But if you have a certain marker, then you need increased choline. And people who have this also have reduced memory. They can have reduced memory, which is improved with green tea, increasing VO2, which basically means increasing your fitness, especially doing sort of high intensity training that allows your body to absorb more oxygen. Higher catecholamines, so taking things like dark chocolate or green tea. Betaine, which helps with reducing your need for choline. Choline, of course, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And walks and good sleep are also going to improve people who have this. So if people have the onset of, you know, my memory is not as good as it used to be, and they have this marker, then it's important to try, as an example, to improve the choline status. Unfortunately, you can't really, they do have choline supplements, but it's not, you shouldn't really be getting your choline from a supplement. The problem is that eggs and liver have the highest amount, and they're much higher than everything else. So a lot of people aren't eating egg yolks and liver. You don't need a lot of egg yolks and liver, but again, a lot of people aren't eating those. But it's also found in meat and fish and dairy and some soy and in vegetables as well. If you take a betaine supplement, you don't need as much choline. That's one way of getting around the choline issue. If you eat eggs, then it's not an issue. Of course, you're getting enough choline. But you need to talk to your doctor and decide whether eggs are something that are good for you. Okay, CoMT gene is basically associated with prebiotics and B12 absorption. So in some people, it increases resistance to some infection and more to others. In this case, you really need to increase the need for prebiotic foods. So what is prebiotic foods? Garlic, leeks, barley, asparagus, of course, miracle noodles as a prebiotic food, pistachios, onions, polyphenol-rich foods, and poor estrogen. Detoxification can happen here as well. And people are more sensitive to stomach acid pills and glyphosate, and anything that affects the gut bacteria. So that includes diet sodas, can deplete this as well. And so that can be an issue as well. All right, so sorry, I got confused over those last two. And APOE2 gene is this gene that codes for apolipoprotein A2. It's basically associated with transporting fat. And if you're eating greater than 22 grams of saturated fat, then it's associated with weight gain. So getting back to the saturated fat discussion, essentially what we spoke about is that if you're eating saturated fat, one group is eating saturated fat that doesn't have this gene, a certain marker of this gene, and another that does. The one that does, if they're eating saturated fat, they're going to gain weight. That's what the studies show, more so. And it might be associated with a signal of satiety, meaning that maybe the people that have this particular version of the APOE2 gene, they are not getting the signal of fullness that would normally come from eating a certain amount of fat, and therefore they end up overeating. That's one theory of why this is happening. So that is the 10 genes, and it's very cursory, very, very cursory look at 10 genes that are associated with health, that are readily tested by any nutrigenomics company. I recommend geneticninja.com. And if you go there and you want me to analyze your results, do let me know. Just contact me. And if anyone has to, someone's asked me about genes and alcoholism. And while there are genes that are associated with, there's no alcohol gene, not like a gene for alcoholics. There are several genes that have been implicated. However, some genes which are thought to be protective with the right environmental influences can be rendered useless. As an example, a lot of people in like Korea and Japan, they have a gene that prevents them from processing the alcohol properly, which leads to a chemical that is very toxic, in fact, and it causes them to flush. So if you ever travel to Asia or Japan or Korea, you'll see a lot of people who drink with like really, really red faces because they can't process a certain part of that. But they've shown that even with that gene, with the right environmental influences, alcoholism can happen. So it's a very complicated picture when it comes to alcohol. So, all right, so we covered all of these different genes. We spoke about saturated fat. We spoke about some like the skinny diabetes gene, so many different things. But ultimately, you saw one thing that is recurring through a lot of our talk, which is basically the fact that you really need to be able to choose your vegetables in the right way, and how you incorporate fat, the type of fat, animal protein, all of these things can be, when you learn these things, can really help you make the decisions that sort of personalize your diet in a certain way. So hope everyone found that interesting. Something I've been learning for quite a while now, and find it exciting. So next week, we're going to talk about depression and mental health as it relates to nutrition. And we're all under a great deal of stress, most people, with the situation that's happening in the world these days, and thought it would be interesting to look at it from a different perspective. So I wish everyone well, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.